So, welcome everybody to episode 3 of this 3-part series on what are called non-CO2, short-lived, or even super pollutants, which are causing a lot of harm to our world and to our people. We're talking about substances such as soot or black carbon, which comes out of, say, diesel engines. We're talking about low-level ozone, which is called smog by most people. And we're also talking about methane. We're talking about chemicals used in refrigerants. They all contribute to climate change in all kinds of different but powerful ways. And also they have big implications for human health, but also for crops and also for our natural systems. So managing them down, managing them out would be a jolly good idea. In the first episode, we looked at what these pollutants are. In the second episode, we looked at government policy as being indispensable for the kind of actions we need to take. And today, we're going to have a look at mobilizing finance. To set the scene on this topic, I have with me Sean Maguire. He's the Strategic Partnerships and Communications Director at the Clean Air Fund. Sean, firstly, welcome. Can you give us your perspective on how finance might or might not be flowing to phase down even the dream of one day phasing out these super pollutants from our world?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Nick. Generally speaking, the financing is not adequate to the urgency of the issue. Mm-hmm. And as you introduced, we're talking here about what we call short-lived climate pollutants. And these are pollutants that have a real near-term impact. Mm-hmm. And whilst it's very, very important that we decarbonize, we cut CO2, and there's a lot of focus and attention on that, that's going to have an impact further out, longer term. Short-lived climate pollutants really have a very intense impact now. Mm-hmm. So it's estimated that, that short-lived climate pollutants are responsible for up to about 50% of near-term global warming. Mm-hmm. So we have both a threat and an opportunity here. If we can address the short-lived climate pollutants, we can buy ourselves some time to get on with the major decarbonization work that we want to do. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, people haven't quite cottoned on to this in the finance world, and the money is not flowing yet. There are one or two sort of beginnings of an exception. So for instance, around methane, there's, at COP28, there was a big funding pledge, $1 billion pledged for work on methane, which is great. It's a start. Mm-hmm. It's not enough even on methane. Mm-hmm. But for other short-lived climate pollutants like black carbon, like ozone, the HFCs that you mentioned, there isn't much money flowing. Just to give you an illustration and an example, we estimate at the Clean Air Fund that less than 1% of all overseas development assistance over the last year has gone to combating air pollution. So, and all of these SLCPs are air pollutants. So that's 1% of all that money that's spent on development is going towards air pollution. So it really is a very minimal amount of money, and financing action is a real challenge. Mm.
And I mean, I echo to that a little bit because I was sitting in this conference room earlier when people were discussing some of these aspects. And I hope I get the numbers right, but they're roughly right. I saw that somebody from the World Bank was saying just to put sort of mini renewable energy grids in, I think it was 20 African countries in certain areas, would cost, 16 billion. And you mentioned this number right now for something that's perhaps even larger, right? Because it's global. So interesting. So that's where we are right now. And do you think that over the next coming years that we might see some sense of people understanding that these quick wins are genuine and that they also at the same time require that financing? Are you hearing anything in the corridors, as they used to say in conferences?
Well, I mean, I think the bigger picture around this is there's a lot of attention to the question of finance. And COP29, which will be taking place in Azerbaijan later this year, is supposed to be the financing COP. Mm-hmm. But, we know the history of negotiations on COP in recent years have all been about how little money there is going in. Mm-hmm. And there's a real sort of challenge for the developed world to fund the actions that need to take place in the developing world. More specifically, I think some of the multilateral banks are beginning to wake up to this as a challenge and are beginning to look at decarbonization as an absolute priority for their lending operations. But I think there's a further piece of awareness raising that needs to take place with those financiers around short-lived climate pollutants, and realizing that that's actually an essential part of the climate finance picture, and they need to be investing there because that's what's going to deliver real dividends in the short term, and as a sensible investment.
Okay, so we might be able to dig into that a bit more in a few minutes. But let me now welcome our other wonderful guests. I have them in no particular order, but I'll have them the way they're written down. I've got Orlando Cabrera Rivera. It almost sounds poetic, doesn't it? It sounds like it could be the beginnings of a pop song. He's head of unit environmental quality at the Commission for Environmental Cooperation of North America. So welcome, very nice to see you. We have Malik Hedara.
Yes.
Yep, great. Senior Climate and Land Advisor at USAID, based in Africa?
In Washington, D.C.
You're based in Washington?
Yes.
All right, great. And then we've got Asmau Jibril, who is Assistant Director at the National Council on Climate Change Nigeria. Do we have him here? No, we don't. Okay, that's fine. We've got Mohammed Sultan, the Regional Lead for Africa at the Global Methane Hub. Phew, you're here. That's super.
Yeah.
And we also delighted to have Sheila Agrawal Khan, who is, I think, the Director now of the Division of Technology, Industry and Economics. Have I got that right?
No.
No, then you tell me what your title is.
Industry and Economy Division at the UN Environment Program.
Okay, the UN system always is more complex. Okay, great to see you here. Okay, so fantastic to have you. Maybe I can turn pretty randomly here to Malik. Funding. Is the funding happening for these short-lived climate pollutants? I mean, Sean says, clearly not enough is happening on this. The question might be why, or is it being hidden under the more general title climate change? Or, I mean, it's probably quite hard to follow the money on this, right? Yeah.
That is correct. Thanks, Nick. And like Sean mentioned earlier, funding for short-lived climate pollutant is very lacking. But I think we did pretty much achieve some quite interesting achievement during the COP28, where governments and have announced nearly over $1 billion in funding since COP27. As you may recall, when we went to COP27, there was a little announcement around finance for methane particularly, right? And now at COP28, we're talking about $1 billion from government, from bilateral aid agencies, in addition to nearly $3.5 billion that are actually being pledged by international financial institutions. That is actually a phenomenal progress in 1 year. I think and we actually hope to see similar improvement again, with the years to come. But I think we have actually reached that achievement as a result of a lot of engagement, a lot of awareness raising that actually been done. As you may all recall, President Biden launched the Methane Finance Sprint during the June 2023 Major Economic Forum. That was pretty much followed by a lot of diplomatic engagement with other bilateral aid agencies, and which help us to actually get to that level of funding now. And the work is not done. There's much more to be done, as you may already know. I mean, from a study that were released in 2022, only 2% of climate finance is actually attributed to methane projects. And that, in order to actually reach the goal that we want to reach in terms of methane mitigation, that level of funding needs to actually be increased by at least tenfold. And there is a lot more work that needs to be done in order to get there.
And is it methane funding or methane funding for tackling the oil and gas industry with their leaks, or is it for waste tips and their leaks? And the majority of that funding for methane, is it going into certain kinds of projects that remove or mitigate methane?
Some of that funding is actually going to in the fossil fuel sector as well as in the waste sector, but the majority is actually going to the waste sector. I think we have about 2/3 of the methane funding going to the waste sector.
Right. Got you. Okay. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the sector and the region that you're from. Are the countries there aware of these short-lived climate pollutants? Are they starting to step up a bit with the finance. What's your perspective?
Yeah, and well, let me put it in perspective too.
Yeah.
We are part of an agreement on the
Yeah.
environment between Canada, the US, and Mexico.
Yes.
And we are part of a trade agreement as well. And we have been doing a lot of work for the last 15 years, actually, on addressing climate pollutants, but recently focusing on short-lived climate pollutants. We have right now focused on reducing methane from the waste sector. We also have done a lot of work in improving the estimates of the emissions of black carbon. So because we're doing this collaboratively amongst the three countries, we need to ensure that the information that we get is comparable and compatible amongst the three countries in order to do a coordinated effort to reducing those emissions. So the three governments put money for a number of projects and initiatives to address the reduction of emissions of those short-lived climate pollutants. Apart from that, we have two grant programs, Environmental Justice for Climate, and also the North American Partnership for Community Action. These are grant programs for community-level actions on climate change adaptation and mitigation, and also addressing the impacts of some of those short-lived climate pollutants.
Okay. What's your perspective, and where do you come into this great big jigsaw puzzle of this massive topic?
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's great to be here with all of you. It's a really critical question. I work with the Global Methane Hub, which is sort of a concrete example of how the world is starting to recognize that we need to act more boldly, more rapidly, with more intent to address methane in particular within the broader climate space. We're a pooled fund of philanthropic actors. A few things that were said are really, really important to set the stage. One is obviously that the funding is not adequate. And it's not only adequate because there's not enough money. We fund every year a report that looks at the state of methane abatement finance globally, and 2% of climate finance goes to methane, but that is also probably not directed necessarily where it could be the most impactful. It is also not adequately distributed geographically. And it also probably needs to at least triple by 2030. There's been improvements, about 20% of methane finance in the past few years, but it needs to triple to get to probably around $50 billion a year just to address these three major sectors. But it is also the case that the way we think about what constitutes methane finance is also not as clear as we would like it to be, so it's hard to track. And so getting a better taxonomy, which is the way in which we define what are actual methane abatement and mitigation tools, what are enabling conditions, which sectors, is also difficult. So there's an underlying structural point that we need to improve so that we can get to the real question of how we move money in an adequate, stable way to the right places for the greater impact. We can go into a bit more detail, but as you said, Nick, it's not necessarily that there is not enough money. In fact, even without we need new money, right? But that's absolutely clear. But even the way money is utilized now could be vastly improved. So if you think about, for example, the existing set of resources that are going into waste management, particularly through multilateral development banks, a few of them, up to a few years ago, were thinking about the methane impact of investing in incineration and landfilling. Today, we've got partnerships with the Inter-American Development Bank. We've got great collaborations with the World Bank. We're talking to the African Development Bank about ways in which they can front load a better understanding of the methane impact of their own loans and investments with countries in ways that are able to reduce long-term methane impact and in line with the developmental objectives that their boards and their constituencies are looking for. So I think there's also this question of matching the money with the projects. We work a lot in trying to make sure that we are supporting countries who in reality are often overwhelmed with all of the different demands, to make sure that they're preparing the right types of projects for the right type of financial vehicle. it's very different to be applying for grant money, which is a very tiny part of methane finance, than it is to be applying for corporate money or equity or debt. And there is that need to make sure that the project preparation meets where the money is, and it is very different types of projects that you have, whether you're talking about the waste sector or the energy sector that you mentioned, or even agriculture, where the demand in research and development, for example, is quite acute.
Yeah. Okay, Mohammed, that was quite comprehensive. Thank you. So, Sheila, we have these regional development banks, we have the World Bank, we have the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, many of these, multilateral sort of bodies that have money in their vaults. And they need to spend it wisely, of course, because they have a lot of people making sure that they do that. Is this, from your perspective, one of the areas of finance that could step up a little bit more to the short-lived climate pollutants in some shape or form, whether it be de-risking investments, whether it be directly investing? What's your thoughts about this?
I think there's let's say, very big space that has not been occupied yet for the short-lived climate pollutants. And that's primarily because, well, let's just take the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, a coalition that UNEP provides the secretariat for. It has set a nice enabling environment for let's say, the foundational work, inventories of short-lived climate pollutants. They're even up to the level of a policy that a country might have put in place, an action plan. But now, how do you get that to move to implementation? How do you get investment coming in from, say, the regional development banks or other financiers? Well, the challenge is that you need to have deals that, at the end of the day, these banks would be willing to fund. So you could call it a missing middle, where you have a plan, you have a strategy, a policy, but actually you don't have the deals. And so these banks are looking for the deals, and so there's a need to step in with the financing to be able to help entities structure deals. So how do you have something that'll generate a rate of return that will pull in the financiers and the investment players into the space?
That's a very interesting point that you make, and maybe we can dive a bit into this, because, I mean, it seems to be wherever you look, whether you look at sort of normal climate finance or whether you could say this, I mean, this isn't specialized climate finance, but it's got some particular targets, right? That particularly in the developing countries, there's always this problem, is there not? That either the loan's got a high interest rate, which nobody can pay back, or the country itself is so in debt to somebody else that it can't possibly dream of even getting the cash. So there's all these kinds of hurdles that have to be leaped to actually, and we don't have time, do we? I mean, we've got 2030 to halve emissions, to have a 50-50 chance of a 1.5 degrees centigrade target not withering and dying. Maybe I can just ask that question before, because I was just intrigued by this Atlantic article, which was saying that, there needs to be guarantees so that the private sector can actually, pile in, because the private sector, it seems to want all around the world, there's a load of money out there sitting around in banks and pension funds, not knowing quite where to invest, right? And it could be deployed, these trillions and trillions and trillions, into something quite useful, but it has to be an investment-grade investment. So the Atlantic article was saying that if you have a $500 billion fund and you analyze the risk of those investments is about 10% failure, you need about 50 billion to guarantee, so that the investors then pile in and go, okay, it's worth doing this, right? Do these come up often now these days, the concept of guarantees, and are they working? Does anybody know? Or is it a new idea?
No, it's definitely not a new idea.
Yeah.
USAID has been involved in guarantees for quite a while. Now, with the creation of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation a few years ago, that is actually the U.S. government entity that is in charge of providing guarantees, particularly to support development projects. At a time when USAID was actually taking the lead on that, we have actually provided guarantees to actually support many projects around the world. Often it's like 50% guarantee that we provide. And it's pretty much an agreement with local banks, and trying to actually incentivize the banks to provide loans to the private sector and other players to support projects, and we will actually pay 50% of any potential default, right? That may result from the provision of that guarantee. And we did actually achieve a lot of result, which I don't have the detail here right now, but it is something that we are still continuing to doing in the current DFC agency right now.
Are there some areas of this story that we shouldn't be relying on the international system to handle? I'm thinking about leaks from the oil and gas industry, right? I mean, these are, in many cases, wealthy companies making huge profits. Isn't that just simply a question of policy where governments simply say, do it, right?
So there is a real place for regulation within the system to incentivize companies to take the right steps. And the private sector really has a strong role to play. We know that there's nothing like the amount of finance required to decarbonize and get rid of short-lived climate pollutants going to come from state and international lending. We absolutely need the private sector. So you need a blend of incentives and kind of regulation that allows companies the security to invest, but also to know that they will bear costs if they do not operate in a clean and sustainable way. And there are not many countries have really got that right yet. So that's it's, I don't know whether it's low-hanging fruit, but it's fruit that needs to be plucked.
Right.
And I think in addition to the policy and regulatory environment that governments have to create, it's also, so UNEP supports what's called the Independent Methane Emissions Observatory. It identifies leaks through satellite data coming from different countries. And it comes back to the oil companies to say, hey, you have a big methane leak here, it needs to be plugged. So the environment is set there for action. The challenge is maybe it's not happening at the pace that's needed. If I can maybe come back to the question on, say, for example, USAID saying, okay, we give out guarantees. Imagine for HFCs, which is another short-lived climate pollutant, and you have cooling happening. So you can, if governments were to put in place the policies and laws and regulations to set standards for what is non-HFC, energy efficient cooling, then businesses have to respond. Now, if businesses have the kind of guarantees that we're hearing about, then they will probably shift to being able to, because they got a market signal, they have a risk of being brought down. And so there is here a chance for a whole different type of cooling so that you don't have very low efficiency HFC cooling equipment coming in, especially into the developing world where you can have a lot of dumping of old obsolete equipment.
So it's a good point, isn't it? Because I mean, one of these short-lived climate pollutants is soot, and that comes from diesel cars, and I know other sources are burning, but so the setting standards on the internal combustion engine, or getting rid of the internal combustion engine, the electrification of transportation in Europe, and but also increasingly in places. I mean, in Nairobi, they're now running electric buses because they've got so much renewable energy, which is fantastic. I mean, this is where regulation or government setting a clear path to a future that we need, then the money follows from the private sector. They invest in the charging points, maybe public-private partnerships for that as well, but the direction is clear where things need to go and things happen, and the soot will go down as well because of that, plus obviously other kinds of emissions.
Yeah, but I think though, in addition to be guaranteed,
No, you can go first. He's going to go second.
Yeah, in addition to the guarantee and the regulatory framework to further sort of incentivize investment, they think another challenge here is the identification of bankable projects, particularly when it comes to mitigation of short-lived climate pollutant. You want to make sure, when the private sector, let's take the example of a methane. And if you have a private business interested in invested in, let's say, incineration, for example, of waste to generate energy, but you want to make sure that that investment is actually viable, is bankable. And in many developing countries, there is not solid evidence, solid history of bankability of this type of project. I think it is very important that despite the fact that there may be guarantees here, and there may be some interest from the private sector. There may be some regulatory framework. The critical part here is the development of bankable project. But I think that will also rely a lot on availability of data as well, right? For instance, in the case of incineration, you need a consistent supply of waste, for example, to operate those incinerator, and how the city will be able to make sure that the operator will have the volume of waste that it needs on a daily basis for the foreseeable future. All of these things are that the private sector is taking into account in order to come up with projects.
Well, picking up on that and what Mohammed said before, just so
Push your voice a bit as well. Just push your voice. So I know we're all a bit hoarse from these meetings.
just picking up on the waste generation and also on what Mohammed mentioned before in terms of the right partnership to make the financing go longer. I think private sector engagement is key to that. And as an example, for example, we had a partnership with food processing companies and restaurant chains on a food loss and waste quantification program for North America. Basically, bringing the private sector together to better quantify the food loss and waste that they were generating, making their operations more efficient, and then that way reducing the waste that could become methane in the long run. So just wanted to...
bring that one in.
Yeah, and also you mentioned data as well. So,
Mohammed, you want to say something?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a lot of great points, and I think it's as everyone said, there's a lot of underlying things that need to sort of improve in order to make sure that the money goes where it is most impactful in terms of the climate impact. But also,
where is it most impactful? I think that was you raised that before.
Yeah, in the methane space, oil and gas, and then the fossil fuel sector is where tremendous amounts of emissions are coming from, and then the food sector, obviously in the agricultural landscape, we look a lot to sort of livestock and rice production, but definitely there's a huge potential to abate methane in the oil and gas sector and in the coal mining as well. But it is also the case that yes, obviously better data is absolutely needed. When we speak about regulations, there's a big move recently to think about trade-related measures, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, obviously because this stuff moves a lot, to set benchmarks for emission standards for the import of fossil fuel. Europe is going that way. The US is going that way. There's conversations globally around ways that we can make sure that we are clear on what constitutes a bare minimum. But in that, it's always going to come down to the implementation, the application, the applicability, and cooperation. We think a lot about this at the hub, that there is the sharing of information, the partnerships that are required, both within the multilateral system, which is great, but is also very slow moving in many ways, is absolutely going to be critical to make sure that if you're a country that is looking for funding, it doesn't take you 3-5 years to get it. It doesn't mean that you have to apply for 15 different processes for similar type of projects. I think we've got to simplify it to the maximum for countries that have either bankable projects or that have regulations in place to make sure that they can access it at a fair, if it is debt, and sometimes it doesn't. It cannot be debt, also inadequate. And you mentioned earlier on that, of course, there's major changes in the sort of the architecture, the financing architecture, and that it may take too long. But I think we still need to continue, particularly for the developing world, to make sure that we are pushing for better conditions for the developing world to be able to access those resources. And we cannot decouple the two. Of course, we've got to move fast, but it has to be consistent. It has to be clear.
What about carbon credits? Because we had this chap, Derry, who is a co-chair, I think, of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition from Ghana, on yesterday talking about government policy. And he touched on the fact that they've got a lot of government policy now in Ghana to deal with these. And so I said, well, what about finance? Because you have policies dripping out of your socks, right? But if you haven't got any money, you can't do anything about it. And he said that they were trying to do the carbon credit route. But then, everyone got excited about carbon credits after the COP in Glasgow, COP26, the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow, and it was all going to boom big time, but it seems to have kind of stopped booming, if I can put it that way. and sort of settle down again to some levels that were a little bit higher than the past, but not as high as people want. Is this avenue blocked at the moment a bit, the carbon credit avenue? Maybe because of negative publicity by some NGOs that don't like the use of certain credits in certain places, or is this,
Well, there's been greenwashing, which has, of
Yep.
course, hampered the whole environment for it. So there's a need for proper methodologies to be able to really make sure that what you're getting credit for is really valid and credible, legitimate. So there is a whole process to try to move that space in that direction. But yeah, there is, of course, the opportunity to use carbon credits. It's just making sure that it doesn't get, there's not a risk of greenwashing in the process.
Yeah.
The other challenge around carbon credit as well is the measurement aspect of it. How will we be able to actually measure the actual mitigation achieved in order for the payment to kick in?
Yeah.
Right. And particularly for some sectors, it's really difficult to measure. In the rice sector, for methane emission, or the livestock sector as well, is very difficult to actually measure the actual emission mitigation. So that often make it a little bit challenging for the carbon market to actually be effective.
So what I'm hearing basically is kind of, I mean, Sheila knows I worked for the UN for many years, and this notion of there are not enough bankable projects, we're not moving the finance, we haven't not got enough measurements, we haven't got this, we haven't got that. And I'm thinking, holy shit, it's 2024 right now, and we've got 6 years to halve global emissions. And I think, according to the International Energy Agency or somebody else, that we've got only a third of that halving possibly done by 2030. So we've got 2/3 to do to halve emissions by 2030. Are you all living in absolute terror that we're not going to actually, sort out these short-lived climate pollutants? Or what can the next COP in Azerbaijan, and perhaps just as importantly or more importantly, the COP in Brazil, do to fast forward climate action on CO2, but also on these short-lived climate pollutants? Anybody got any ideas of what they want to scream for in these COPs?
I think first of all, I think the COPs have necessarily been very focused on CO2. In the last couple of years, we've seen the COPs focus also on methane. And in the last COP, there was language inserted around looking for action on all non-CO2 pollutants. Now we need to see much more concrete action behind that, behind the non-CO2 pollutants. We need to see flesh there, and we need to see programming, and we need to see finance come in there. So I think the diplomats and the countries are beginning to wake up to the fact that short-lived climate pollutants are a huge challenge, but also an opportunity for action. So I think that's what I would like to see begin to happen in Azerbaijan. And one way that you can get into that is, I work for the Clean Air Fund. We're very focused on air pollution. Going for air pollution gives you health benefits, and it gives you, you can get it black carbon, you can get it ozone as well, which are other short-lived climate pollutants. So bringing air pollution into the story in the COPs, beginning to talk more about climate and health, is another area where we could see international action progress faster.
Right.
I would say that, because as you say, we're saying on the one hand we want bankable deals, and on the other hand we don't have them, basically. And so instead of miraculously thinking they'll just appear, I think the seed funding to be able to take some of the work on policies, strategies, and say, okay, now what are the potential deals that can come, and how can these be seeded so you have let's say this missing middle starts to become an engine rather than waiting for the deals to happen. Because right now we have one group, which is the regional development banks, looking for the deals and other financiers. We have another group looking at the policy, regulatory side, the data side. And there's this big gap that is just not being addressed, and it needs money to be put onto it at a ground level to be able to say, actually, let's move this into a more scaled up action. Otherwise, like you say, it's a very long journey to go from inventories to planning to strategies and then to get to actual scaled up investment action.
Is it because that the finance community writ large is on one level highly risk averse these days and very cautious, and yet we've got this other thing out there which is clear from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we've got a hell of a bigger risk out there right now called climate change and public health and many other things. There has to be that we've got to take a bet on the future, haven't we? Maybe I shouldn't use the word bet, but it's not a poker game. But we've got to take a bet on the future and take some risks, haven't we?
Yeah, I think that's really right. And maybe to put a positive spin on this, we've really been thinking about what you've been describing, sort of that gap, right? And so, for us, it's really taking advantage of the spotlight being shone on methane in particular, and trying to move that. So, in Asia, we're working directly with cities and governments to build projects and pipelines, bankable projects, putting in grant money to make sure that cities and companies are able to build up their pipeline and potentially get to financing. This is grant money that's used directly to make sure that it is scaled. We are working with the Inter-American Development Bank, putting a grant resource with them. They have a $500 million waste portfolio that can be moved to really think about addressing methane in the waste sector. We are in close conversations with the African Development Bank, same thing. And the reality is we want to see the money being applied in ways that are meeting developmental and climate goals as their mandate is, and really fill that gap. And this is where I think philanthropy can play a particularly interesting role, because as you said, private sector may not be the first mover in many occasions, many occasions, although they need to be. And so philanthropy can play that role, and it cannot fill that void. It cannot fill that void alone.
Yep.
The one thing I want to add, Mohammed really made a really good point. I think public funding will be very critical to actually show some proof of concept, right? Fund some projects that are perhaps innovative and achieving some result, and that could eventually inform, the development of a bankable project that can perhaps incentivize the private sector to actually step in. So initial funding from a private sector, from a public sector is really critical. That's one reason why USAID is actually taking steps to what I call usually methanize our portfolio, whatever there is opportunities, trying to actually further elevate the methane mitigation opportunities that we have in all of our dairy productivity project, solid waste management project, as well as energy project as well. So we can come up with a lot of good example of a project that can be funded.
What about, I just want to get back to the private sector again. I mean, we have large numbers of companies now that have set science-based targets. They're supposed to decarbonize their products and their operations, and then they're supposed to go all the way down their supply chains and get rid of pollution, decarbonize those as well, working with supply chains that go around the world. So are non-CO2, short-lived super pollutants in science-based targets? Do they or not? And if they aren't, shouldn't they be there? And then the private sector would, if they want to achieve their climate targets under the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for example, they would have to work with their partners and companies down the supply chain to tackle those things. I don't know the answer to that. If you don't know the answer, it's not a problem. But it's something that we put out to the audience maybe to reflect on, because I would have thought that was an opportunity that might be a missed opportunity if it's not.
Yeah, we've done some work to look at the various kind of reporting regimes out there, and particularly from the perspective of air pollution and air pollutants. And we are not really finding any mention in those reporting regimes of air pollutants. They're very focused on greenhouse gases. So we've got an effort to try to work with companies, multinational companies, to get them to report on measure and report and ultimately reduce their air pollutants along their value chains in parallel with doing their greenhouse gas measuring, reporting and reduction. So that's a thing called the Alliance for Clean Air, and that's companies are beginning to report, but it's an initial step. But ultimately, the vast majority of private enterprise out there is suffering the ill effects of air pollution and short-lived climate pollutants, but not realizing they have a role in combating it. So, air pollution will send your workers home sick. They have to take time off to look after sick kids. So absenteeism and lower productivity. And yet, at the same time, they can take action within their supply chains and their means of production to contribute to a cleaner world, and they're not voluntarily doing so yet, apart from a few exceptional front runners.
Well, on that as well, and also what you mentioned before in terms of the messaging of the next COP and all that, you mentioned, at the COP28 we held, there was a link made with health, and we don't talk about the cost, monetized cost of health impacts of the pollutants. I think that has to come to the forefront in order to make action.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've got to have the full economics of all these things so that we know what we're doing to ourselves and make better choices. That's absolutely clear. Just looking then at some of these wider, I have to mention fossil fuel subsidies. Do we all think they should be phased down and spent on getting rid of methane and black carbon and other things like that? Why do you think? They're up again. I see they're now 3 trillion direct. Is it 1.3? Am I right? Trillion. They were 900 billion, weren't they? A couple of years ago. They seem to be higher now.
I think the key is to repurpose the subsidies so that at the end of the day, at the worker level, you're not paying the price of it, and it needs to be a just transition where if you're a coal miner, you're a worker at low income level, and you can have the subsidy repurposed in a way that can help fuel the clean energy transition, but at the same time make sure that workers' jobs are still secure in a different way, maybe even in a safer and better way and more stable way than what they have today.
Absolutely.
The figures are extraordinary. The 1.3 trillion is from the IMF. So there's a huge opportunity there. But as Sheila said, there's a reluctance from governments to destabilize the status quo. And there will be vested interests in the way economies are currently run. So there's a little bit more political courage needed. There are some good examples out there of where countries have already started to repurpose subsidies away from things like kerosene, which is a sort of lighting fuel, which is absolutely horrible for health and is full of black carbon. And they've redirected subsidies away from kerosene towards a transition fuel such as gas, or ultimately onto renewable energy, electricity. So there are models out there that can be learned from.
Right. Good. Well, we can't solve all the problems this afternoon, this evening, or wherever you are in the world, but we are trying to reveal, in a sense, this area of the short-lived climate pollutants, these super pollutants, and the fact that they need some special attention, whether it be on policy, whether it be on finance, or whether it be on the public, understanding that they're out there and demanding of their politicians' action. So thank you very much for being here with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and We Don't Have Time TV, and look forward to seeing you again in some part of the world, hopefully where it's even cleaner and cleaner every year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.